The British campaign didn't end with the destruction of Washington. They would continue to make movements through the Chesapeake, from the capture of Alexandria to the bombardment of Fort McHenry. We'll explore the strategic decisions, the daring actions, and the unexpected consequences that shaped this chapter of the war. And from the deck of a ship, Francis Scott Key witnessed the relentless shelling of Fort McHenry. And the sight of the American flag waving defiantly in the morning light inspired him to pen a poem that would become a symbol of national pride and unity in the United States. The burning of Washington was by no means the end of the campaigning by the British in the Chesapeake region. While Major General Robert Ross and his troops were leaving Washington, a separate column was advancing towards Alexandria, Virginia. The force was under the command of Commodore James Alexander Gordon, and the target was initially Fort Washington, not to be confused with the city itself. The only fortification on the Potomac River, it was around 13 kilometers downstream from Washington, D.C. The force under Gordon did have a tough time getting towards Fort Washington. They spent a number of days trying to get past the Kettle Bottom Shoals. This adventure would see them get grounded in the shallow water around 20 times, according to Gordon. As the British fleet approached Fort Washington on August 27th, they opened fire. Gordon noted what happened in his official report, quote, "A little before sunset, the squadron anchored just out of gunshot. The bomb vessels at once took up their position to cover the frigates in the projected attack at daylight next morning, and began throwing shells until about 7 p.m. The garrison, to our great surprise, retreated from the fort, and a short time afterward, Fort Washington was blown up. The American officer in charge of the fort, Captain Samuel Dyson, had been ordered to hold the fort and only demolish it if outflanked and attacked from the rear. After just 2 hours of shelling, he spiked the guns and blew up the magazines. He would later be court-martialed for abandoning his post and was dismissed from his service. There was now an open path for the fleet under Gordon to Alexandria. The next day, the mayor of Alexandria rode out to the British fleet and asked for terms of surrender. The town's clerk, Israel Thompson, summarized what happened next. On the morning of the next day, to wit, the 29th of August, the British squadron arranged itself along the town so as to command it from one extremity to the other. The force consisted of 2 frigates, to wit, the Seahorse, rating 38 guns, and Euralius, rating 36 guns, 2 rocket ships of 18 guns each, 2 bomb ships of 8 guns each, and a schooner of 2 guns, which were but a few hundred yards from the wharves and the houses so situated that they might have been laid in ashes in a few minutes. The British would take all the merchant ships in the town and every bit of loot in the city, including flour, tobacco, cotton, and more. The British would hold the town for 3 days before Gordon received orders from Admiral Alexander Cochrane to rejoin the fleet in the Chesapeake Bay for the next phase of the campaign. Gordon would rejoin the rest of the fleet on September 9th, and it would set up the next stage of the Chesapeake campaign. With Washington in ruins, the next goal was to hit the prosperous port of Baltimore. The busy port was home to ships who carried a letter of marque from the American government, making them legal pirates as long as they only targeted British shipping. Ross would make his approach to Baltimore by land at North Point, while the ships would lay siege to Fort McHenry, which was the fortifications in the harbor. The problem with the plan, however, was that the delay in waiting for Gordon to get back to the fleet had allowed the Americans to consolidate their defenses. This consolidation was needed. It was mainly militia in the area, and they were nowhere near as well prepared as the British when it came to combat. On September 12th, the assault began. Ross and his men, 5,000 strong, met up with the Americans at North Point, around 8 kilometers from Baltimore itself. The Americans had sent 3,000 men under General John Stricker to delay the British to buy more time for the defenses in Baltimore to be finalized. A small detachment of Americans went to draw the British out into battle. The skirmishers would get the attention of Ross, who went to see what was happening. It was then he would be shot in the chest and died shortly afterwards. The command of the British forces was now in the hands of Colonel Arthur Brooke. Brooke organized his men and advanced on the American positions. The assault took heavy casualties as the Americans managed a fighting withdrawal. The British would continue advancing while the Americans moved back, but then Brooke ordered his men to hold around a mile away from the main American position. The British had suffered severe casualties, but would move towards Baltimore along the North Point Road. The defenses they found there were much stronger than what they had anticipated. Waiting for them in Baltimore were more than 10,000 regular troops, not militia. As well, 100 cannon had been brought in to fend off the attackers. Brooke ordered his men ahead, and they were able to take some of the outer defenses, but couldn't hold the inner defenses of the American positions. The British were outnumbered, outmanned, and outgunned. Brooke called for his men to return to the ships, and the decision was made to let the Navy shell Fort McHenry. They had the firepower to do it as well, with 7 frigates, 3 schooners, a rocket ship, and 5 bomb ketches. Now, this is when we should explain what a bomb ketch is. They were ships that were equipped with mortars as opposed to cannon. They would fire in a ballistic arc with explosive shells that were called bombs. And they were specifically designed for the shelling of land positions and could cause serious damage. These ships were also sturdily built, and they needed to be in order to handle the recoil of the mortars without bursting apart at the seams. The British fleet would move into position on September 13th and began shelling the fort throughout the night. One of the ships involved in the attack would go on to fame for other reasons, the HMS Terror. Back to the battle. The British continued to shell the fort for the next 25 hours, but little damage was caused. This was in part due to reinforcements being built by the Americans. A small landing party attempted to distract the Americans to allow for another assault, this time on the eastern side of the city. And it was at this time that the Americans raised an oversized American flag over the city. Now, it is said that the flag was raised to taunt the British. However, the flag was raised every morning, and that was just the case on September 14th. In terms of the land assault, Brooke had been ordered not to attack the American positions unless the British outnumbered the Americans. They did not, and eventually Brooke would withdraw again back to the fleet. The British would withdraw entirely from the area and regroup before they could attempt another assault on the United States from the waters of the Atlantic, more like the Gulf of Mexico. And it would be many of the same men from the Chesapeake campaign who would go on to take part in the Battle of New Orleans in just a few months' time. One other thing came out from the Battle of Baltimore. While on a truce ship, where he had been working to secure the release of a prisoner, Francis Scott Key, a lawyer, watched the shelling of Fort McHenry. Then, the next morning, he saw the American flag raised above the walls. He would start to jot down the poem, Defense on Fort McHenry. The poem would be set to the melody of the song To Anacreon in Heaven. Eventually, the title would be changed to the name of the flag that Key saw raised on the morning of September 14th, the Star-Spangled Banner, which is now the national anthem of the United States. And so our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In the next episode, the war's focus was shifting north. The British were amassing troops in Canada, preparing for a major offensive into upstate New York. The goal was to seize control of Lake Champlain and the Hudson River, effectively cutting off New England from the rest of the United States. Meanwhile, in the neutral city of Ghent, Belgium, diplomats from both sides were engaged in tense negotiations. The hope was to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict that had dragged on for over 2 years and caused so much bloodshed. And far to the east, in the disputed territory of Maine, tensions were rising. British forces had occupied significant portions of the state, and a series of skirmishes and raids had erupted. This conflict would spark a long-standing border dispute that wouldn't be fully resolved for decades to come. The fate of Maine hung in the balance, adding another layer of complexity to an already multifaceted war. Thank you for traveling alongside me. If these stories have sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more hidden histories, and give us a like if you enjoyed the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.